Something changed in the Rolex market in January 2026, and most buyers haven't caught up yet. For the fourth consecutive year, Rolex raised prices across its entire catalog on January 1. Steel models averaged a 5.6% increase per the WatchPro analysis of the leaked dealer catalog. Gold and two-tone references absorbed 8 to 9%. A steel Submariner that cost $9,500 a year ago now retails at $10,050. The no date crossed $10,000 for the first time in its history. The Daytona in steel crossed $16,900. These aren't dramatic numbers in isolation, but stacked against secondary market floors that have been shifting all year, they change the calculus on which reference you buy. Walk into an authorized dealer today with $15,000, and you can make a decision that either compounds quietly for the next decade or bleeds value the moment you walk back to your car. The price tags are close. The boxes look the same. Nobody behind the counter is going to explain the difference. That's what this is for. 5 pairs, 5 decisions, all of them defensible on some level, not all of them right. 1. Buy this. Submariner, no date. Ref. 124060. Not that. Submariner date. Ref. 1266. 10LN. Start with the most contested argument in modern Rolex collecting. It's also the one where the answer is most misunderstood, by collectors who've owned both and by buyers who haven't yet owned either. The Submariner date is the world's most recognizable watch. When people close their eyes and picture a Rolex diver, that's what they see. The Cyclops lens over the date window at 3 o'clock. It's not just a complication. At this point, it's practically a logo. And because it's the obvious choice, most first-time buyers choose it, which is exactly why the no-date variant is worth understanding before you default to the default. After the January 2026 price increase, the 124060 retails at $10,050, landing $590 below its date-equipped sibling. On the secondary market, WatchGuys shows it trading between $11,500 and $14,500, depending on condition and completeness, consistently above retail. The 126610LN date trades higher in raw dollar terms, around $13,000 to $15,000, which looks impressive until you run the percentage math. Both watches are clearing 20% above retail. The no date is doing it at a lower entry price, with less capital at risk. But the financial case is the secondary argument. The real case is mechanical and aesthetic. Inside the 124060 sits the caliber 3230. Inside the 126610LN sits the caliber 3235. These are siblings from the same 32XX architecture, and both have been touched by the lubrication issue that watchmaker forums have tracked since 2019. The seconds wheel pivot on these movements needs precise oiling, and when the lubricant migrates early, amplitude drops and accuracy suffers. Forum threads on Watch You Seek about this ran into the hundreds of pages before Rolex quietly updated parts in later production batches. The 3235 carries one additional layer of complexity over the 3230. The date mechanism, more parts, more pivot points. The 3230's simplicity is not an accident. It is the architecture of a tool watch designed to do one thing and keep doing it. Then there's the dial. The Submariner case is one of the most precisely proportioned objects in modern industrial design. The spacing between the lugs, the visual weight of the hour markers, the negative space across the dial, all of it was calibrated in 1953 and refined in millimetric increments ever since. The date window interrupts that geometry. The Cyclops lens adds visual mass at 3 o'clock that the rest of the dial simply doesn't carry. Collectors who've owned both tend to describe the no date as the one they can't stop staring at, and the date version as the one they actually reach for every morning. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A watch you reach for every morning wears better, ages better in your memory, and sells better when you eventually decide to move it. Per watch charts, the 124060 sells in a median of 22.5 days in current market conditions, faster than 88% of watches tracked. That's not a purist vanity metric. That's liquidity, and in a secondary market where prices can shift over weeks, liquidity is the number that matters most when you decide to exit. Picture the buyer who chose the date version in 2020 because it felt like more watch for the money. They're not wrong. The date is useful. Actually useful. But the buyer who chose the no date because the symmetry wouldn't leave them alone has a watch that's just as liquid, less capital deployed, and zero date wheel to service in a decade. For a first Submariner, the no date is the harder flex and the easier hold. One more thing, the counter conversation never surfaces. In 10 years, when the 3230 needs its first full service, you'll send in a movement with fewer parts to disassemble, fewer components to inspect, and no date mechanism to realign and test on reassembly. Independent watchmakers charge by complexity. The no-date service is measurably cheaper across every reputable independent shop. Over a decade of ownership, that difference compounds quietly in your favor. It's not a dramatic saving, but it's the kind of detail that separates buyers who are thinking about owning the watch from buyers who are thinking about having bought it. Which of these two would you pick? Let me know in the comments. The Submariner debate is aesthetic and philosophical. What comes next is purely about reading market data correctly, and most buyers in this specific comparison are reading it backwards. 2. Buy this. GMT Master 2 Root Beer. Ref. 126711. CHNR. Not that. GMT Master 2 Zombie. Ref. 126713. GRNR. This is where analysis circulating in collector circles gets it wrong, and it costs people real money. The 126713 GRNR is called the Zombie, not the Guinness. That nickname circulated briefly when the watch launched at Watches and Wonders 2023. Someone compared the black and gray bezel color stack to a pint of stout. Zombie won out, quickly and decisively, because the muted palette of the gray-black bezel against the black dial against the yellow-gold accents struck collectors as unusually somber for a Rolex sport watch. The gray element carries a kind of pallor that feels different from the celebratory tone of a Pepsi or a root beer. By early 2024, it was standard across dealer listings, forum threads, and auction catalog descriptions. And the Zombie is not a bad watch. It carries the caliber 3,285, trades above its $18,500 retail post, the January increase, and per watch charts is up 8% over the past year. Chrono 2.4 listings for unworn examples were sitting around $23,400 in May 2026. If you bought one at launch, you're fine. But the case for the root beer rests on something the Zombie hasn't built yet. Structural collector vocabulary. The 126711 CHNR pairs oyster steel with Rolex's proprietary Everose Gold, a rose gold alloy engineered to resist fading and color shift over time, and a brown and black Cerachrom ceramic bezel. The warmth of the combination is specific. Not flashy, not understated to the point of anonymity. The root beer occupies a space the gray-black Zombie deliberately avoids. Color that reads differently depending on the light and the context, a warmer palette that sits comfortably against both casual and formal dress in a way that few two-tone references manage. The root beer name traces back to the 1970s. The vintage 1675 thirds and its brown and gold aluminium bezel is where the nickname was coined. Clint Eastwood wore a 16753 on screen through the 80s. The reference history is 50 years deep. That history is not nostalgia, it is liquidity infrastructure. Say, root beer in a watch shop in Tokyo, Dubai, or Geneva, and the conversation starts at the same place every time. That kind of globally shared collector vocabulary inside an already dominant brand is rare, and it has real monetary value the day you decide to sell. The honest caveat: the root beer is not outperforming the broader Rolex market right now. Watch Charts shows it up 3.3% over the past year, against a brand average of 7.3%. Singapore Watch Insider reported in January 2026 that two-tone GMT models as a category had struggled to gain traction through 2025, trading close to retail while all steel references pulled ahead of the index. The root beer is an underperformer relative to, say, the Bruce Wayne Steel 126710 GRNR. But relative underperformance is the condition in which patient collectors find entry, not exit. The root beer is still above retail. It still sells faster than almost 9 out of 10 watches on the secondary market. And it has a collector history the zombie won't accumulate for another 15 years. The zombie is priced at a premium now precisely because it's newer and rarer. The root beer is priced like a watch the market hasn't fully caught up with yet. Those two sentences describe different risk profiles. One of them is the better buy in 2026. Consider the buyer who picked up the root beer in 2022 when it was trading just a few $100s above retail, and everyone on WatchUseek was calling it boring relative to the all-steel Pepsi. That person is sitting on a watch with established secondary market history, low volatility, and a brand nickname that has outlasted at least 5 others that came and went. The Pepsi, incidentally, was discontinued in its steel configuration at Watches and Wonders 2026 inches April, and that event pushed more collectors toward the remaining in-production GMT references. The root beer absorbed some of that attention. Rolex's 2026 price increases also affect this calculation in a specific way. Two-tone references, like the root beer, saw increases in the 4.5 to 6% range per the confirmed price lists, which raises the retail floor without immediately raising the secondary market ceiling. In the weeks after a retail increase, secondary market prices for two-tone references tend to adjust slowly, as Singapore Watch Insider noted in January. That lag creates a window. A buyer entering the root beer market in the first half of 2026 is entering after the retail floor moved up and before the secondary market fully follows. That's not a guaranteed outcome, but it's a better entry condition than buying at the peak of secondary market momentum, which is what the zombie currently offers. A watch that looks stable in a rising market isn't the exciting story, but in a secondary market still working through the effects of 4 consecutive years of retail price increases, stable and liquid is exactly what protects capital while you wait for the next conversation-starting piece. From reading market cycles correctly on the GMT, to the date-just trap that catches more buyers than any other reference on this list. 3. Buy this. Oyster Perpetual, 3/6 bright dial, ref. 124200. Not that. Date-just 4. 1 smooth bezel. Oyster bracelet. This sounds like an insult when you say it aloud. The Date-just is a more expensive watch. It has deeper heritage, more configurations, a longer waitlist, and considerably more presence on a wrist. How can the recommendation be to buy the cheaper, simpler thing? Because the specific Date-just configuration most people end up buying is not the configuration the Date-just was designed to be. Here's what I mean. The Date-just earned its place in every watch history book with one specific look: the fluted white gold bezel on a Jubilee bracelet. That combination is the reason the Date-just photo exists. The flash of the fluted bezel against the 5-link bracelet is the visual argument the watch makes for its own premium. It is coherent. It is complete. The fluted bezel Date-just 41 on Jubilee in oyster steel retails around $11,700 per the January 2026 price list, and its secondary market performance reflects a watch with a reason to exist at that price. The smooth bezel Date-just 41 on an oyster bracelet is a different negotiation entirely. Strip the fluting and replace the Jubilee with an oyster bracelet, and you have a watch with a date window that retails around $8,500 to $9,000 and looks, to anyone who isn't a devoted collector, exactly like an Oyster Perpetual that somehow got more expensive and slightly less interesting. The smooth bezel contributes none of the visual vocabulary that justifies the Date-just name. The oyster bracelet is the correct bracelet for sport watches. On a dress watch, it reads as an afterthought. Secondary market prices on smooth bezel date-justs on oyster bracelets consistently sit near or below their original retail, and the Loop Watch Guide documents this pattern explicitly across multiple references. Now look at the Oyster Perpetual, 36. After the January 2026 increase, it retails at approximately $7,350. The most collectible configurations introduced since 2020, specifically the turquoise, candy pink, and Tiffany blue dials that Rolex began producing when it started treating the OP as a testing ground for color, have been trading at significant premiums on the secondary market. Some bright dial examples traded above $12,000 in 2021 and 2022, and while those peaks corrected with the broader market, they established that this watch has a collector ceiling far above what its retail price implies. Inside the 124200 sits the caliber 3230, the same movement as the no-date Submariner. 70-hour power reserve, anti-magnetic, in a case that costs $4,000 less to enter. For that saving, you give up a date window and gain a watch that, in the right dial configuration, has become one of the more interesting designs in the Rolex catalog. The OP didn't look like that 10 years ago. It looks like that now because Rolex decided it was worth making interesting. The smooth bezel date-just on an oyster bracelet is a watch in identity crisis. It can't decide whether it's a sport watch or a dress watch, so it ends up being neither with full conviction. The market doesn't know what to do with it and prices it accordingly. Buy the OP in a dial you love, or buy the date-just in the configuration it was built to be. Don't buy the configuration that falls between. There's a specific scene that plays out in watch shops often enough to have become almost routine. Someone comes in asking about the date-just. The sales associate walks them through the fluted bezel version and the smooth bezel version. The fluted is more expensive. The buyer looks at both, decides the smooth bezel looks more understated, and walks out with the oyster bracelet version. 3 years later, they're listing it on Watch You Seek or Watch Crunch at a slight loss relative to what they paid, writing "priced to sell" in the listing title. The fluted date-just buyer from the same day is usually still wearing it. The OP, 36, for its part, has become the watch that makes people stop to ask what it is, particularly in the bright dials. There's a specific coral red configuration and a Tiffany blue that Rolex released in the early 20s that still stops conversations cold in rooms where nobody is talking about watches. That's rare for a watch at this price point. And it's the kind of thing that doesn't show up in secondary market data until it already shows up in secondary market prices. Have you ever bought the wrong configuration of a great watch? You probably know what it feels like. Tell me about it below. The date-just trap is about buying the wrong version of a great watch. The Explorer comparison is more specific than that. It's about respecting original geometry. 4. Buy this. Explorer 36 Ref. 124270. Not that. Explorer 40 Ref. 224270. In 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay reached the summit of Everest. The watch that made that climb, or at least the design that came to represent it, was a 36mm Rolex with a black dial and Arabic numerals at 3, 6, and 9 o'clock. Simple, unreadable in no-light condition, purpose-built. That was the formula. Rolex kept it for over 5 decades. In 2010, they expanded the Explorer to 39mm. In 2021, they pushed it to 40. The caliber 3230 made the 40mm version technically superior to anything that came before it. Nobody disputes the movement. The argument is purely about what happened to the dial in the process. At 40mm, the 369 Arabic numerals that define the Explorer visually, that separate it from every other three-hand Rolex, float in a field of negative space the original 36mm ratio never had to manage. The markers that look bold and purposeful at 36 look proportionally smaller against the expanded dial surface of the 40. This is not an optical illusion. It's arithmetic. The dial grew faster than the markers were allowed to grow with it, because Rolex chose to preserve the proportions of the numerals relative to the case lug design rather than scale them up. The result is a watch whose most distinctive feature, the thing that makes it an explorer rather than an anonymous three-hand sport watch, reads slightly less confidently than it did at the original dimensions. The 124270 Explorer 36, relaunched in 2021, corrected this. Same movement as the 40mm, same ceramic crystal, same bracelet architecture. But the 369 ratio to the dial diameter is back where Edmund Hillary would recognize it. The 124270 sits flat on the wrist. It clears a dress shirt cuff. It disappears under a jacket sleeve in a way that a 40mm watch simply cannot. And monochrome watches confirmed that it received one of the smallest price increases in the January 2026 catalog, rising roughly 2%, while the steel average was 5.6%. That pricing restraint is a signal. Rolex knows the Explorer 36 sells on character, not on price escalation. They're not pushing it. But the secondary market has been. The 124270 trades above retail with steady, reliable liquidity. The people buying it aren't doing so because it's the safer financial option, though it is. They're doing so because it's the correct watch. When a tool watch returns to its original specification after a decade of drift, that isn't nostalgia. That's a manufacturer admitting what the market was saying all along. The Explorer 40 is not wrong, but the Explorer 36 is right. And there's a specific kind of satisfaction that comes from wearing a watch in its correct form. The 124270 on a wrist next to a dress shirt is exactly what it should be. Present without demanding attention, legible without fanfare. Precise in a way the wearer notices every morning and nobody else notices at all. That's not a selling point Rolex puts in their press materials. But it's the reason watchmakers who've been in the industry for decades tend to gravitate toward it. Understated is not the same as boring. Understated is confidence with nothing to prove. The Explorer 40 buyer often chose it because it felt more substantial, more modern. 40mm is closer to what the wrist expects in 2026. These are reasonable reasons. But substantially and correct are different qualities, and the Explorer was designed to be correct before the word substantial entered the conversation. One detail worth noting: the 124270 took a longer time to find its footing on the secondary market after the 2021 relaunch. Early reviews were mixed specifically because the 36mm felt smaller than what buyers expected. That early resistance has since resolved. The watch found its audience, and typically, a reference that takes time to find its audience appreciates differently than one that sells out on day one, because the late appreciation carries less froth. Original proportions versus expanded ambitions. The final entry makes a simpler argument. Buy the engineering, not the material it comes wrapped in. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. You walk into a store or browse online, and everything looks the same, but behind the scenes, there's a system. Prices aren't always fair, availability is controlled, and one bad decision can leave you overpaying for something that doesn't even hold its value. That's why I created a complete free insider guide to buying watches. Inside, you'll find the best watches to buy, the watches to avoid, and how to choose a watch that actually fits your style and budget long-term. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the free guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. 5. Buy this. Skydweller steel with white gold bezel, ref 336934. Not that. Skydweller solid gold, ref 336938, 336935. The Skydweller is the most mechanically ambitious watch Rolex produces for the general catalog. That sentence is not debatable. What follows from it, once you accept it, changes how you think about the material question entirely. Inside every Skydweller sits the caliber 9002. This is Rolex's annual calendar and dual time zone movement, operated through the ring command system. A mechanical architecture where the rotating bezel communicates directly with the crown to switch between 3 operational modes, allowing the wearer to set the time, the home time, or the calendar without any additional pushers or correctors. The annual calendar distinguishes automatically between 30-day and 31-day months, requiring only one manual correction each February for February's shorter run. Rolex spent over a decade developing this system. There are watchmakers who've studied it for years and still find new things to understand about how the ring command bezel engages the movement. That's the watch. In every sky dweller, in every material. Now, the solid gold versions. The ref. 336,938 inches, yellow gold, and 336,935 inches white gold, absorbed the January 2026 price increases at the gold tier, approximately 8 to 9% across precious metal references, per the WatchPro analysis of the leaked dealer catalog. Gold prices surpassed $4,400 per ounce in late 2025. And because Rolex produces its own gold in-house at their foundry, those commodity costs flow directly into case and bracelet pricing. Several gold Rolex models were documented as trading below their new retail prices on the secondary market in early 2026, per Everest bands, because the retail price jumped faster than secondary market values could adjust. The steel Sky Dweller with white gold bezel, ref. 336934, carries every mechanical feature of the gold versions at a meaningfully lower entry price. The caliber 9002 inside it is identical. The ring command system works the same way. The annual calendar catches the same months. The dual time zone reads 2 cities simultaneously. You don't have hundreds of grams of gold on your wrist, which at the current gold price means you're not also financing a significant commodity position every time you put the watch on. On Chrono 24 in May 2026, steel Sky Dweller examples with box and papers were trading in the high teens to low 20s in thousands of dollars. That's above retail, which means the market assigns a meaningful premium even to the steel version, reflecting genuine demand for the complication regardless of material. One observation I keep returning to with the Sky Dweller gold debate: the people who buy the gold version are often buying the material first and the movement second. Once they understand what the movement actually does, the material tends to become secondary. The collector, who spent time with a Sky Dweller at a boutique counter, asked the sales associate to walk through the ring command system and then went home and watched 3 videos about the annual calendar mechanism before buying. That person almost always buys the steel version, because by the time they understand what they're buying the caliber, not the case. The caliber 9002 is the watch. The gold case is the gift wrapping. Buy the engineering. This is probably the one on this list that the greatest number of buyers get wrong, and not because they're making an irrational decision. The gold Sky Dweller looks extraordinary. It commands respect in a room the way few watches do. It announces its own value without the wearer saying a word. These are real things, and they matter to real people for real reasons. But there's a version of buying the gold Sky Dweller that goes something like this. You see it in the boutique, you fall for the presence of it, you buy it, you wear it for a year, and then someone at a dinner asks you what it does. And you say annual calendar, dual time zone, and they nod politely, and you realize that you've been wearing the most mechanically interesting watch in the Rolex catalog without ever fully explaining to yourself what it actually does. The ring command system is worth understanding before you buy. Not because it changes whether you buy the watch, but because understanding it is what makes the watch worth wearing. The bezel doesn't just rotate. It shifts the crown between modes, each click engaging a different mechanical register. The annual calendar's month sector display, tucked into the chapter ring at the dial edge, advances automatically and then waits for the wearer to intervene only in February. That one moment of manual correction per year is the system's only compromise, and it's an honest one. The sky above your wrist is showing you 2 time zones, and the month, accurately, indefinitely, with that single exception. Once you understand that, you're no longer wearing expensive gold. You're wearing a caliber, and the caliber costs the same in steel. The steel Sky Dweller also sits in a part of the Rolex catalog that doesn't get as much collector attention as the Submariner or GMT, which means its secondary market premiums are based more on the complication's actual desirability than on status-seeking momentum. Collectors who buy it know what they're buying. The buyers are informed. Informed buyers create stable, rational secondary markets, which is exactly the kind of market condition where a watch holds value without requiring a bubble to sustain it. The Submariner's secondary market premium is partly complication and partly icon. The Skydweller's is almost entirely complication. Those are different foundations, and over a long holding period, the complication-first foundation is the more durable one. Drop in the comments. Would you buy the steel Skydweller or hold out for gold? Every watch on this list is a Rolex. None of them are mistakes. The Date Submariner is not a bad watch. The gold Skydweller is not a trap. The Date just exists in configurations that justify every dollar of its price. The point is specificity. In a market that just reset prices upward across the entire catalog for the fourth consecutive year, the difference between a good Rolex decision and a great one isn't the brand. It's which version of the brand you chose, in which configuration, for what reason. The no-date Submariner is the right answer for a specific kind of buyer. The root beer is the right GMT for a buyer who values established secondary market history over short-term momentum. The Oyster Perpetual in a bright dial is the right answer for a buyer who refuses to pay a premium for a configuration that can't justify it. The Explorer 36 is right because the original design was right. The Skydweller steel is right because the complication is worth the money and the gold isn't what makes it worth it. None of this requires expertise. It requires one question the boutique never asks on your behalf. Not what do you want to buy, but why do you want to own it? Answer that clearly, and the list above writes itself. What makes Rolex difficult to navigate in 2026 isn't quality. Every watch they make is well-constructed, well-serviced, and will outlast its owner if maintained. The difficulty is noise. There are 50 ways to spend $10,000 in the Rolex catalog, and most of them are defensible. But defensible is not the same as right. The no-date Submariner is defensible and right. The smooth-bezel Datejust on an Oyster bracelet is defensible and costly. The difference between those two outcomes is almost always a single conversation the buyer didn't have before they bought. Have the conversation now. With yourself. Before you walk into the boutique. Drop the pair you'd argue with in the comments. I want to know where the disagreement lands, because that's usually where the most interesting analysis starts. And if this is the kind of market thinking you want before spending this kind of money, like and subscribe. More of this is coming.